Today's episode has been brought to you by OfferingTree. If you are a yoga teacher who would rather spend more time teaching and sharing yoga and less time fixing and designing a website or sending Zoom links or sending emails, you need to check out OfferingTree. I've been using their software in my own yoga business, and I'm so impressed both by their customer service and how they are adding features and updates with the feedback from yoga teachers just like you and me. So if you want to spend more time on the mat and less time in front of a computer, go to offeringtree.com/Shannon to get a special discount and make sure to sign up for the 14-day trial where you get to try it out for free. Again, that's offeringtree.com/Shannon. Hello and welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher Podcast. If you are a new listener, hi, I'm your host, Shannon Crow. I use she, her pronouns. This podcast is being recorded on Anishinaabeg, Odawa, and Mississauga land, also known as the Bruce Peninsula in Ontario, Canada. If you are a returning listener, you know that I've been sharing some random facts about me, and I've been loving the feedback that all of you send when I share these here on the podcast. It really makes me laugh. And today's random fact is that actually, in real life, Wayne Gretzky, the famous Canadian hockey player, is my cousin. And this is a fact that I do not share with many people because, one, it's a distant cousin, and two, no one believes me, to the point actually where one of my first cousins went to school, told his whole class in elementary school that his cousin is Wayne Gretzky, and he got in trouble for lying. And the teacher reached out to his mom, and his mom had to tell the teacher, no, that's actually a real thing. Wayne Gretzky is our cousin, a distant cousin. So shout out to the Gretzky family. I know that at one point my family tried to get them to come to our family reunion, but they were busy. So if you have a famous relative somewhere out in the world, let me know who it is. I promise I will believe you because I know what it feels like when people don't. I'm also a mom of three, a yoga teacher, podcaster, and founder of Pelvic Health Professionals. And later in today's episode, I'll tell you about some of the exciting things that are happening over inside of Pelvic Health Professionals. We have an amazing lineup of guest speakers coming up and topics that we are going to cover. So I'll tell you about that a bit later. Today's podcast, and just in general, the Connected Yoga Teacher Podcast, was created for you because I understand what it's like being a yoga teacher, being an entrepreneur, running a small business, and I wanted a place where you could come and hang out and feel connected to the information and inspiration that is going to support you as you run your unique yoga business. Today, I am thrilled that you get to meet Barb Elias here on the podcast. She has been a close friend of mine for years. I love attending her yoga classes. Barb and I used to live about 30 minutes away from each other. Now she lives in a different province. We're far, far away from each other right now. I've talked about her before here on the podcast because years ago, she was my coach at one point when I was working on trying to add in more self-care to my life. My kids were younger then, and I really had felt like I had lost touch with who I was in many ways. I was just working or caring for the kids and really reaching this point of brownout or burnout a lot. I didn't think that I had time for rest or self-care. Like I thought I was too busy for it. It makes me cringe just thinking about this now. And it wasn't working out for me. You know, some of us do that at some point in our lives. We try and really go. And yeah, it didn't work for me. And that isn't what we're talking about today on the podcast. That's not why I asked Barb to come and chat with us. I asked her on here because she's an expert in bone health and yoga. Barb works with students who are concerned about low bone density, and she teaches in such a beautiful way. She weaves in all of the information that she has learned over the years to create a really unique yoga practice. I feel like I'm always learning more about my body. And there's this element of mindful movement in her classes. Barb also has a passion for pelvic health. Her and I geek out about this, and we've actually co-taught some workshops together. And I'm excited about this interview today because many of our yoga students are dealing with low bone density, maybe osteopenia or osteoarthritis. And some of those students don't even know that they are dealing with these conditions. So how can we teach yoga in a way that is safe for students who are dealing with low bone density, and also in a way that doesn't promote more fear around movement, but instead offers ways to strengthen and move mindfully? Barb also understands this topic on a personal level. She was diagnosed with low bone density herself, and I learned so much from her as she navigated through this in her own yoga practice, in her strengthening practice, and also as she learned and took different trainings and learned from her healthcare team. So let's dive right in and learn from Barb today and learn more about how we can support our yoga students who might be dealing with low bone density. Welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher Podcast, Barb. It is so great to have you here today.
Oh, Shannon, I'm so excited to, hear your voice and connect with you and chat about something I have a real passion for. So thanks for inviting me.
Well, I'm so excited that our listeners get to meet you because I've known you for a lot of years. I feel like I've talked about you a lot on the podcast and bugged you for a long time to come on the podcast. So this feels like a super exciting day. I'm really glad that we get to talk about yoga and bone health and that you get to share why you're interested in this. So tell our listeners who maybe don't know you, how did you get into studying bone health and yoga?
Well, I came into yoga as a child because my mom was a yoga teacher. So I've kind of come in and out of practicing it all of my life. I dove in as a teacher a little bit later in my life, in my late 40s. And I, loved the practice. And then I was diagnosed with osteoporosis. That came about because my sister was diagnosed with osteoporosis, and we're very similar. And I just thought, I never thought about bone health, and I never thought about my bones. But as I began to kind of, read a little bit more, I got concerned. And I went to my doctor, and she said, "Sure, let's check it out and give you a DAX test," which is an X-ray, a simple little X-ray. And yeah, sure enough, I had low bone density in my hip and frank osteoporosis in my spine. So that sent me down a rabbit hole of, what is osteoporosis and what is bone health and how the heck did I get here? That was the biggest question. How the heck did I get here? Because as you know, Shannon, I'm a mover. I move a lot. I love to move. So what was going on with my bones? Why are my bones low in density?
Right. And I want to highlight that I've known you for a long time and you are a mover. Like you thrive on walking, hiking, biking, anything. If I was like, "Hey, Barb, do you want to go try do this thing?" if it involved movement. And you also have a ton of knowledge around how the body works in terms of so many aspects of health and wellness. So I love that you are highlighting, how did I get here? What did that feel like when you were diagnosed?
Well, it was, kind of shocking. Like I said, I was a mover. So it was like, well, wait a minute. Like I move and I think I eat a healthy diet. I am sort of very aware of my health. I've always been health conscious. I had a mom who was super health conscious, sort of raised us in that environment, but it felt overwhelming for one thing. It felt really overwhelming. It felt frightening. It really scared me. Like, what does this mean? I have low bone density. I have osteoporosis. Am I going to fall apart? Am I going to be broken? And images of, older women, with a dowager's hump walking with a cane came to mind. And I'm like, that's just not the image I had for myself as I aged. So yeah, a lot of fear. And then a lot of questions about, well, what's going on here? And so I wanted to learn more. And then the practice that I love. So yeah, I'm a mover, and I leaned into movement that I later discovered, while really good for me and on many levels, maybe wasn't the best kind of movement to spend so much time in, which was cycling. I'm a big cyclist, and I still am. I love to cycle. And swimming. But both of those movements actually don't contribute to bone health at all, and may even, if you do them a lot, like I did, they may even be bone depleting. So, the kind of movement I chose wasn't really supporting my bones. And then the practice that I loved, yoga, which was my foundational kind of at-home practice. I had all kinds of questions about what does that mean? Like, can I still practice yoga? And what are the implications if I have frank osteoporosis in my spine? So what does that mean for how I move in and out of postures? So what I learned, do you want me to kind of dive into that piece, Shannon, a little bit about what I discovered about myself and why maybe I arrived here?
Yeah, I think that would be super helpful. I also want to highlight that knowing you, even before this, you were looking at so many aspects of the body in terms of strength training. You were looking at like mobility and hypermobility. I have learned over the years so much from you, not just about yoga and movement, but definitely about those things. So to hear you say, now I have questions about this and I'm going to dive into this. Like, I was never excited as your friend to hear, oh my gosh, Barb has been diagnosed with something relating to the bones, but I knew that you were going to get to the bottom of it. Like, I feel like out of all the people, you're like the movement detective in the world. So yeah, tell us what you came up with.
Well, yeah, I have a real natural curiosity. I guess in hindsight, if I spent more time studying science when I was a kid, which I didn't, and now I love, which is so fascinating. But anyways, if I'd spent more time in science and understood some options for career paths, maybe I would have gone into, becoming a physiotherapist or into medicine, or I don't know. But now I love the body. I love body mechanics. I love learning about the body. And I have a body that's an interesting body. I'm small boned. I'm small in my frame, right? Like Shannon, I remember my girlfriend years ago sitting beside me, and she just looked at my arm and she picked up my arm, my wrist, and she just said, "Oh my God, you like have chicken bones. Like, you just have no bones." And that was years ago. So, I naturally come into this. I'm a small boned woman. I'm slight. I tip over the course of my life to maybe being underweight versus overweight. So all of that is kind of genetics. That's kind of a big piece of the puzzle, which was genetics. And as I learned and researched and dove in, I began to understand that, yeah, genetics is a big piece of the bone health equation, but it's just one piece. There's a lot more to it. I began to learn that while I was a real mover and I moved a lot, the way our bodies process and use calcium relates to the energy cycle, to our breath. Every single time we take a breath, we use calcium. Calcium is part of the whole breathing complex, which I think is so fascinating because all these areas of interest of mine, as you know, I'm also interested in yoga for pelvic health and hypermobility, et cetera, because all those things impact my life. They intersect. So, calcium is a big part of our breath and we use calcium constantly. And I learned that if we don't have enough calcium in our diet and our bodies just naturally cycling around, and for the most part we do. But if we don't, we can deplete that reserve and the body will naturally take care of itself. It will do anything it can to breathe. So it'll just start to pull calcium from our bones. So I wonder, I don't know this, but I wonder, and there are other people, researchers out there wondering if there's a depletion factor. I tend to be a depleter. I tend to run myself to, the end. As you know, I love to feel fatigue.
Yeah.
So there's this whole piece, still kind of out there being researched and they're trying to learn a little bit more about kind of the bigger picture piece. And then I started to learn that while I was a mover, I wasn't strong. I mean, I don't know what other word to use, Shannon. I wasn't strong. I was pretty weak. So even in my yoga practice, while I moved through all of my postures, and I had a lot of mobility in my body. I don't know that I'd say I was hypermobile anymore now that I've learned more about that, but I certainly tipped over to the really mobile side. And I think some of that had to do with the fact that I just had sleepy, not well used muscles, and they just went to kind of full, end range extension pretty quickly and easily because I wasn't using them a whole lot. I learned that, a lot of what they're starting to think about osteoporosis, and it is rising in our population, especially here in North America. And there's a lot of questions around why. And of course, diet could be a part of that. We consume a lot of fats and sugars, and there's all kinds of things they're kind of diving into. But one thing they do know, Shannon, one thing that, is pretty solid is that bodies that have strong muscles have strong bones, because muscles are what remind the bones to build and grow and remodel. So I didn't have that kind of structure. I didn't have that kind of frame. I didn't pick up heavier things. I, threw my kids in strollers most of the time. I mean, really, I didn't lift a lot. I didn't pull a lot. I didn't push a lot. I didn't do those things. I walked a lot, I moved a lot, and I flowed a lot in yoga, but I didn't really challenge my muscles. Does that make sense?
Well, it does, but I also want to highlight for our listeners who maybe don't know you is me knowing you and seeing how much you move. I would never say, oh, Barb's not a strong person. You look strong and able to move and do many things. And so for you, I remember when you told me this and I was like, wow, this is fascinating, fascinating for you to look at this. And the other thing I want to highlight is that you actually got to the point, and maybe this is already a spoiler alert, but you got to the point where you built your bone density back. So this is another reason for us to really be listening for our own bodies and also our students' bodies of what do you think made that difference? So I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to add to contributing factors that you think are part of it.
I think genetics is the big one, but I think the one I have the most control over, and the one I had the most control over through the course of my life, because I don't have control over my genetics, is focusing a little bit less on sort of the cardiovascular side of my movement cycle, if you will, and really looking at building more muscle, simply building more muscle and having more muscle. I'll just touch on that idea, Shannon, of you not thinking about me as strong. I wouldn't have thought of myself as not very strong either until this light was shone for me. And I began to really look at and examine sort of how I move and the ways I move. And I started to realize, I am not that strong. I'm able to move a lot, but I'm not that strong. My body doesn't tend toward muscle development. And, I started to realize even at the gym, and I'm not a big gym person, I'm going to talk about that because that's where I really came up against a bit of a wall, because I'm not someone who loves to go into environments where there's bright lights and maybe loud music and, other people doing their own thing and kind of coming into my space. I love the yoga space. That's my space to really tune into my body. And but when I did go the odd time throughout my life, because I would recognize, maybe I need to do a little bit more with my muscles, kind of go I would pick up weights and like a personal trainer, would give me a 10-pound weight and I'd be like, okay, I can't do anything with that. Give me an 8-pound weight or a 5-pound weight. So, I wasn't that strong. And here's an interesting thing, and maybe we'll talk about that later, but I want to say it before I forget, because this is just, I just am so fascinated with the body. And the reason I'm fascinated is because of how the body and the mind are so interconnected. The more, Shannon, I have focused on bringing strength into my awareness, in my practice, in my day-to-day life, everything I do, the stronger I get in my body, the stronger I feel emotionally. The more grounded I am, the more clear-minded I am, the more solid I can be in my own 2 feet. So that's a really interesting observation for myself personally, and something that science is proving out to be true, that if you're strong in your body, you're strong in your mind. I think it's cool.
That is really cool. Oh my gosh, I love that so much. And I want to ask then, because you're like me, it sounds like going to the gym. I don't really enjoy going to the gym. And there's a message out there in the yoga world, like you can build strength in your yoga class. So have you found some practices where you're like, actually, yes, I can not have to go to like fluorescent light gym with loud pumping music, but also have a strength practice? Or like, what are some of the resources that you would suggest?
Definitely. So my yoga practice has changed completely and in some ways full circle, which is interesting because my first response to this diagnosis was to push away and move away from a lot of my traditional yoga practice and move more into sort of traditional strength related work. And where I am now, because that doesn't really work well for me, is integration of strength inside of what I consider to be my yoga practice. So that means so many things to so many different people, and there's no one definition. But, for me, I've sort of landed on yoga is the environment in which I move. So yoga is where I tune inward, become very mindful of my movement, maybe slow down, really tune into my body, become more aware of how I'm moving in space. Proprioception and having awareness of where my body in space was really low for me. So that has gone up monumentally through my yoga practice. And that's contributed significantly to how I now bring strength into my yoga practice. So it still looks like a yoga practice and feels like a yoga practice to me. It's bookended. I start, as you know, because you've attended some of my classes, as you know, I always start in Shavasana and I always end in Shavasana. And that's exactly how my personal practice looks. I bring all the other little tidbits of information I've learned, yoga for pelvic health information into my practice, etc. But throughout my practice, I now weave in opportunities to load my body, to maybe carry a weight and move that weight through space as I move in and out of postures. I bring bands into my practice and use bands to feel my muscles engage and, to really call upon my muscles to work. So that's what you would see. If I was to film myself and send it to you, you would see my practice still looking a lot like a traditional yoga practice in some ways, but then really blended into that would be these opportunities to bring strength in. And where I had to strike a balance, Shannon, was, and this is the piece that I find so fascinating and where people struggle. So when I was first diagnosed, I went to a physiotherapist, and she's wonderful and she's an amazing resource. And I would highly recommend people check her out. Her name is Margaret Martin. She's in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. And she has a resource called Melio Guide online, where all kinds of information about movement and osteoporosis and how to work with your body. But I'll share with you that my experience and the experience of a couple of other people is that, she's so passionate about strength training that she kind of overwhelmed me with, here's all the things you need to do. You need to, get weights, and we need to do, weighted lunges, and we need to do arm curls, and we need to do this, and we need to do that. And I really kind of started there, and just not me, Shannon. It's not me. So I had to find a way to sort of take that prescription, if you will, for doing more traditional strength training, 3 sets of 8 reps with a weight that you fatigue at 8 reps. I had to find a way to kind of reconcile that into how I will move for it to be sustainable, because otherwise I wouldn't do it. It doesn't matter that somebody prescribed it to me. If it's not me, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to do it for a while and then I'm going to fade away. And it's not really going to change anything. So I had to find a way to build it into my practice. So how can I bring my practice and into my day-to-day life? So I took what I learned from her. I took what I learned on strength training generally. I went out into the world and started to look at how I can bring more strength into my yoga practice, because that's sort of the foundational practice for me. That's the place where I do focused, mindful movement with my body. It's my opportunity to work in a supportive, healthy beautiful way with my body. That's what I started to do. So I began to bring weights into my yoga. I began to bring bands into my yoga. I still maintain the essence of what a yoga practice looks like for me. And when I teach my students, I do this with them too, but it still looks and feels very much like a yoga practice. And I get really positive feedback from them because they get kind of both ends. They get, the relaxation, they get the mindfulness, an opportunity to check in and tune in, and they get to feel their bodies working and moving with weight and resistance in a way they've never really felt before. And they get to feel this in a supportive environment that feels a lot less like work. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like work to me.
Well, and I love how you call out like this person in Ottawa is a physiotherapist who knows what they're doing and they're an expert. And you were like, that's great, but I need to make this fit for what I like to do. Because when you were explaining like doing all those things and doing like a half an hour to an hour of weights, well, you know me, you gave me a movement practice with weights when you were my coach. And I just rail against it. I did it. I did my homework. It was definitely helpful. And you worked with me to make it customized for me. So it sounds like you did that for your own practice.
I definitely did it for my own practice.
Yeah. Hey, connected yoga teachers, I have a quick note to share with you here because we've had a lot of questions lately about memberships and how to create one. When you start to have a loyal group of yoga students who show up for you week after week, creating a membership is a really great way to transition to a more reliable income that you can count on and a way that yoga students can access your replays and the information that you have and the yoga that you have to share on their own schedule. So think about Netflix and how that works. You're not waiting for the movie to play at a certain time. At any point, you can go on there, you pay your monthly membership. It just comes, out of your credit card and you have access to everything in there. If you are thinking that that model would serve both you and your yoga students, make sure to check out OfferingTree. I've been running a 6-month group program using OfferingTree, and it's been making my life so easy. I've used other platforms over the years for this type of model, and I love how OfferingTree has many, many things here that are specific to yoga teachers. So, for example, I can choose what my members have access to, whether that's videos, PDFs, audio files, text, and for how long. I can take registrations on there, payments, I can send out automatic emails, and there's Zoom integration. And I love that OfferingTree thinks of all of the options that yoga teachers need. So right away when I'm in there, I can choose, do I want members to sign up for a month, a year, a week, or another amount of time? Or would I rather skip the recurring payments and choose a package option? All along the way, as I'm putting in the details of my offering, this is where I see, okay, OfferingTree gets this, and they've built this based on the feedback from yoga teachers. For example, they ask me on there, do I want all of my participants to sign a waiver form? This is one of those details that you might not have thought of as a yoga teacher, but OfferingTree has your back in this. They've thought of it. They've been asked by yoga teachers to have this option. So if you've been looking for an easier way to run the online part of your yoga business, check out OfferingTree. It's an easy all-in-one tool where you can host your website, schedule classes and private lessons, and sell memberships. And we have a special discount for you because you're a podcast listener. Head to offeringtree.com/Shannon for 15% off 1 year or 50% off the first 3 months. That's offeringtree.com/Shannon for a special discount. Alrighty, let's get back to our chat with Barb, learning all about bone health and yoga. I also wanted to highlight, because you were talking about before, the importance of rest. You've told me this before, and I always associated movement and strengthening with bone health. But can you just touch on again, why is rest a thing?
Yeah, that's an interesting area that it's more intuitive for me, and an area that there are some researchers curious about this. But if I don't respond, this is my belief, if I don't respond to my body's natural need for rest and recovery, then I'm just depleting it. So if I'm just working it really hard all the time, then when does it have a chance to recover and grow muscle and grow bone? And where do the resources for that growth come from if I'm depleting it? So rest is a huge piece for me. And that is another part of the anchoring of the yoga practice. So I come into the practice in Shavasana. I end the practice in Shavasana. And throughout, I add in these opportunities to really focus and become mindful about how I move my body, and add load and weight and resistance with resistance bands. And then I rest again and come into some of the more gentle movements, the quieter movements, the more inward turning movements. So I don't come out of my practice feeling depleted, which I do if I do an hour of strength training. I come out feeling energized and ready for the day. Or if I do it at night, and sometimes I do it at night. I mean, when you do it is, so personal, right? And sometimes I come into my yoga room, kind of early evening, and with the intention of just doing a really gentle kind of slow practice. And then the next thing you know, I am holding weights and pushing weights, or lifting, or, doing more what you might think of as traditional kind of strength training, like push-up type related movements, or movements to really focus and strengthen my hips, because hips are a really common place for a fracture related to osteoporosis. So I really want to strengthen those areas of my body. And yet I come out feeling, kind of ready for bed and ready to rest. I don't feel wound up or charged up. So yeah, I've just learned to weave it in. The other thing that's changed for me, Shannon, that's a really important piece too, that I feel that isn't always being spoken to, is the marriage. On the one end of the spectrum, you have strength training. So as I just described to you, when I say strength training, the image that comes to most people's minds is these sets that you do in a gym, and it's hard and it's heavy and it's, really demanding on the body. And yes, all of that is what we think of. And some of that we need a little bit of in our lives for sure. And we need that for bone health. We need strength, but maybe not that way. On the other end of the spectrum is the more gentle kind of flowing movement. We need that in our bodies. We need this quiet time to rest and pause and observe and notice and move slowly. And then in the middle is this other piece that I've become really passionate about, which is, maybe more commonly referred to as the mobility work. But I don't know that anybody in the osteoporosis world that I've heard of is really speaking to this. So, my physiotherapist really prescribed heavier, weightlifting, but because I was so weak to begin with, and I really was, like I had areas of my body that, my shoulder girdle, my hip girdle, et cetera, were really not very strong. I really needed to do a lot of work to just build all the little tiny muscles through mobility work, which isn't related to lifting weights or using resistance bands, or might be related to resistance bands. Resistance bands can really help with mobility work, but it's not about weight training per se. It's more about focus movement in areas of the body that engage and call to play the muscles in that area of the body.
Right. And so then how long was it before you went back for another bone scan, and then you were like, oh, whatever I'm doing is working?
Now, so I'm gonna really qualify this. I want to believe I actually turned the ship around a bit and increased my bone mass, and it's possible I did. My X-rays suggest I did, but it's also possible that because we're doing an X-ray and we're doing, hopefully the same machine, but I did move in. As you know, I moved from Ontario to Manitoba, so I couldn't go back to the same machine, et cetera. There is some possibility that some of what's showing up on my scans is just because it was a different technician and a different machine and a different time and place, right? But what I will say with confidence is I've stabilized. I'm not losing bone right now at the rate I was, which was pretty fast. And here's the thing that you need to know is that starting at around the day of menopause, I say the day because I just loved listening to Shirley Weir on your podcast the other day. So the day of reaching menopause and coming into the period of postmenopause in my life, which for me was around age 50, I learned that I was a small boned woman to begin with. I probably had, tipped on the lower bone density side to begin with. But coming into menopause, because of the changes in our hormones for women especially, the degree of loss can really ramp up to 8% of our bones a year.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. Pretty scary. And that can last around age 65. And then it does tend to plateau a bit. We still continue to lose right to the end of our lives, but we lose at a slower rate in our older years. But it's that period between around 50 to 65 that we really see a drop down in our bone mass. And that's the period where there's a real opportunity to, turn the ship around, if you will, and start to really change how we work and move with our bodies. But emphasize here that every stage of our life is that opportunity. We grow and build and model our bones until we're about age 20 on average. It can be a little younger for young women and it can be a little older for young men. But around age 20 is when we model our bones and grow our bones. And then between 20, 25, and 50 is sort of a period where we're relatively stable and we see a little bit of bone loss, maybe less than 1% a year, maybe just a little bit of bone loss trickling away. But that's a tremendous time to become aware of our bodies and become aware of, am I kind of taking care of all the things I need to take care of, including my muscles, along with my cardiovascular strength and wellness, along with my other areas of care, my pelvic health, my mental health, all of it, right? So that's a really good opportunity. And then coming into our postmenopausal years, that's a period to become really aware that bone loss can really ramp up and we have control over that. We can influence that. We have an opportunity to step in and positively impact our bone health during that period. If not actually building bone, certainly replacing the bone that we have.
Right. Well, this is so evident of how all of our students are within that age range. Like you've just given a tremendous age range. If you think that we're building bone when we're younger and then we're trying hard to maintain and work on it. And then like all the way along, we can work on this. I'm curious now, are there some things that you just don't teach anymore to a group class, knowing that, because what are the statistics now for osteoporosis, osteopenia, or low bone density?
So yeah, I'll just comment on what the differences are there.
Sure.
Not everybody might know, but osteoporosis is a diagnosis that you might get today, which basically suggests that your bone mass is below normal for where it should be for a woman or a man of your age. And that it puts you at a higher risk with other factors, including your bone mass, taken into consideration, puts you at a much higher risk for fractures. So that's what a diagnosis of osteoporosis is. Osteopenia is a term that's used less and less. Today, you're still going to hear it, but it's used less and less because it's confusing to a lot of people. It's basically now, they'll just refer to you having low bone density. So that's basically what osteopenia means. It means that your bones are slightly less dense than ideally we would like them to be for a man or woman or for a person of your age. So that's what those terms mean. And has it changed how I teach? Definitely. I'm 58 years old. I tend to teach a population of mostly women, some men who are 45 plus. That tends to be who comes to my classes because of my passions and interests in areas like pelvic health and bone health, et cetera. I definitely attract those kinds of students. Chances are, because a majority of the people in my class are women, and the majority of those women are over 50, chances are 1 in 4, maybe even 1 in 3 now, the statistic is changing, has frank osteoporosis in their bodies, and they probably don't know. A lot of people don't know. A lot of people have not been diagnosed, aren't aware because of some of the recommendations around who gets diagnosed and when. The recommendation is anyone 65 and plus should have a bone scan. And between 50 and 65, it depends on a whole list of factors. I was able to get my scan because my sister was diagnosed. And I have no idea, because she was in that age group too, why she got diagnosed, but there was some triggering factor there that her doctor suspected bone loss. So I just assume that there are people now in my class who have low bone density, if not frank osteoporosis. And this is where it gets tricky because there's a lot of debate in the yoga world, the movement world, doesn't matter what world you're talking about, but if it's related to movement, there's debate about what movements are good and what movements are bad. And I don't think any movements are bad, Shannon. There's no bad movement. But there are movements that done repetitively that do put people with osteoporosis or low bone mass at greater risk. And so what I say is I try to make sure that if we do those movements in class, we do them with real awareness. We definitely don't work or move toward end range. And I'll speak to what some of those movements are. So we don't go to end range. We work sort of within a healthy kind of controlled range of motion. I definitely do less and less of them. And I replace those movements with more and more opportunities to build strength into my body. So there's no loss there. It's not like, oh, you can't do that. I don't even look at them as can'ts. I just look at them as what can I do and what could I be doing here to build bone strength and muscle strength and overall strength. So yeah, I definitely am more cautious with some things. So basically the recommendations, and I follow the recommendations of an organization called Osteoporosis Canada, which is an organization that has a medical board, 16 researchers and doctors that sort of provide oversight to all of their recommendations. So they're, very reputable and they base everything on the latest science. And they basically recommend if you have low bone density or osteoporosis that you limit the amount of repeated or sustained, weighted or end range, rapid or forceful, or a combination of any of those related to flexion, rotation, or side bending. So basically that what you want to think of there is forward folding would be an example, right?
Okay.
So I teach forward folding now in a way that I would call spine friendly and with less focus on rolling down and rolling back up. And I am teaching to a population where there's a higher risk that they have low bone density and osteoporosis. If I were teaching to a younger population of healthy men and women that, didn't have a high risk, I would speak to the fact that, they should know about their risk factors because you can get osteoporosis earlier in life because of all kinds of medical conditions that can contribute to bone health. I would maybe comment. I always think it's important as yoga teachers to share a little bit of knowledge about things like bone health. I would talk about bone health, but I might teach more flexion and I might even teach weighted flexion because I want to grow a healthy, strong spine when I'm in my 30s and 40s. But now that I'm a 58-year-old woman with frank osteoporosis, I'm not going to weight any flexion. And I'm in fact going to be cautious with flexion because that's what the research says. And the reason that's the case is because of the way bones work in our spine. Without getting too much into the details, when we flex forward, we put pressure on the inside line of our spine, so our tummy side of our spine. And in those pressure points, we can cause micro damage to the trabecular bone, which is this really interesting, less dense bone that's inside of our vertebrae. We can cause little microfractures. And over time, and this is the thing about osteoporosis and fractures in our spine, over time, those microfractures build up and we have more and more and more and more and more of them until we have an actual diagnosable fracture on a X-ray. So it's not like, oh, one day I broke my vertebrae. Your vertebrae has probably been compromised and slow degradation of those bones has happened over a long period of time because of lots of movements that put the spine with low bone density at risk. So I move away from that in my yoga practice.
I think that's amazing. I have a couple of questions now and they go in two different directions. So just to clarify before we move forward from the flexion part of things. So if we stick with the example of forward fold, what are some of the changes that you make to your own forward fold now, knowing that you have been diagnosed with osteoporosis?
So I take the focus away from the forward fold as an opportunity in my body to bring varied movement into my spine because I'm concerned about that varied movement being, potentially at risk for my spine. And I place the focus instead on strengthening my legs and my hips So I generally think more about hip hinging, gently bending my knees, and keeping my spine a little more neutral as I come down into a forward fold. And I might not, depending on my body, aim at all for reaching any space. I'm not looking to reach the floor necessarily unless I actually start to come down into a squat to touch the floor. So it's less about rolling down and coming to full extension in those hamstrings. And don't get me wrong, I still want to work those hamstrings. I really want to work those hamstrings. I want to strengthen those hamstrings, but in other ways, not necessarily through my forward fold. So I keep the spine neutral. I really focus on keeping the spine neutral. And in fact, I even go beyond neutral. And I really think instead about rolling my spine down, I think about extending and lengthening my spine, because what we do know is that as we age, we really want to build the muscles that support extension of our spine, lengthening of our spine. This will help to protect us from possible microfractures and then bigger fractures down the road if we have low bone density or osteoporosis. So that's kind of how I change my forward fold. So you'll see my forward folds kind of, knees will bend a bit. I will hip hinge. Then I might bend knees more. And then to come back up, I will really focus and I will really encourage my students, instead of focusing on rolling of the spine, my focus is on pressing through the heels and using the strength of my legs to elevate my upper body.
Right.
And it's a balance, Shannon, because I still want to be strong in my spine. So I do lots of things to strengthen my spine, but I don't do those things loaded in flexion, because if I already have low bone density, it's a risk-reward trade-off. And for me, the risk of compromising my vertebrae and creating microfractures is greater than the reward I might get of protecting my spine down the road. So I look at it from that point of view at this stage. It's like everything. It depends. If I was 30, would I be doing it differently? You bet. Right. You bet I would. If I knew I had, no risk of low bone density for other reasons. Because bone, as I said earlier, you can have low bone density in your life for other reasons at earlier stages.
So then when you were talking about microfractures, and I'm guessing, like you had already said with your own story, that there were issues of fear that came up and you questioned your movement practice and different things along the way. I'm guessing that our yoga students showing up into a class, or maybe they're not even coming to class then, I'm guessing that some people get diagnosed with osteoporosis and then think, oh gosh, I shouldn't move. I'm guessing that they tip over into that fear of movement because it could cause a microfracture. So what do you say to those students?
Yeah, I think that's really common. And I also think, and here's the thing, if you want to continue to practice yoga, to go find someone who teaches yoga who has knowledge of bone health and osteoporosis, and who has some knowledge of what some of the limited movements should be. What are, I don't love to use the word safe because it just creates more fear, but movements that are spine friendly versus movements that might not be as spine friendly or might increase some risk. So I think what happens is people don't even know where to go. I don't know that a lot of yoga teachers are out there getting training and then putting themselves out and saying, I'm bone friendly. I know how to teach a class and I can help teach a class that's bone friendly. So they just don't go to yoga anymore. I think that's very true. I think they stop going. And that's so unfortunate because I just believe this. I'm so passionate, Shannon, about yoga as the place we can learn the most about ourselves and our bodies. It is action with self that we can begin to move in ways that are supportive for our bodies if we have low bone density. So it's the place I want to see students showing up. But I suspect they don't because of the fear. The fear is overwhelming. And I work with students who have osteoporosis one-on-one. And that's the biggest thing is to really create for them this positive sense of opportunity. What can I do? And let's focus on all the can do's. And let's move gently away and learn a little bit about what we might want to avoid or limit. But let's not make the focus that. Let's make the focus on what we can do. So we don't even notice when we're doing a yoga practice that we're not doing so much of something. We don't even know. We're not even aware of it,
Right. How can yoga teachers learn more from you?
So I am bone health trained, or bone fit trained with Osteoporosis Canada. Osteoporosis Canada is an awesome organization. We're very, very lucky to have them here in Canada. I know there are equivalents in other countries, so I would encourage you to look into your, national osteoporosis organization to find out what they might offer that's similar.
I am so excited that you are doing this work to get the word out there about how to take care of our bones. I mean, they're the entire foundation for our body. And I'm just grateful for all the work that you do and for your friendship. Thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, thank you, Shannon. You are an anchor in my life. And even though we're much further apart, I don't get to see you in person. The fact that we can connect this way is it's brilliant and wonderful and such a gift. And especially during this time right now. Yeah. So thank you so much for inviting me to come. And there's so much more, Shannon. I will say this. I'm looking at all my notes and everything, and I feel like we've just touched the surface.
Thanks so much for today.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Shannon. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you so much, Barb, for coming on the podcast and talking with our Connected Yoga teachers today. Connected Yoga teachers, I have to tell you, Barb is one of those friends who, doesn't get a lot out of being in the spotlight, doesn't really want to jump out and say, I'm the expert in this. And so I've been bugging Barb for a while to come and talk with us. And this is why you can tell why after today's interview, Barb has so much knowledge. And I love how she really teaches in a way that adds more inquiry and more questions for me. Anyway, as I've attended her classes and co-taught with her and just chatted with her as a friend, I walk away really excited about how the human body works and how our brain works and what really helps us to take care of ourselves. If you would love to continue this conversation, there are a few ways to do that. You can head over to the show notes. That's over at theconnectedyogateacher.com/271. Any of the links that we talked about will also be there for you. And you can go back and re-listen using our timestamps. So if you think, I wanted to re-listen to that part of the interview, we've got the notes all written there for you. And if you scroll down to the bottom, you can leave a comment. Also, you can leave a comment anywhere on social media and tag us, or let's continue this conversation in the Connected Yoga Teacher Facebook group. Tell us what were your key takeaways of this episode or what questions came up as you listened. Also, if you are enjoying the podcast, have you left us a review? This is really a way to say thank you if you are enjoying the podcast episodes that we're putting together, or it's also a way to give us your feedback. You can leave that in a review. So you can head over to iTunes to do that, or any show notes page has a button there where you can leave a review. It means a lot to us when you do that. It really helps others to also find the podcast. So thank you if you are sharing the podcast with friends, if you have left us a review, and also thanks for hanging out here and listening. If you want to hang out a little bit more in real time, I'm also over at pelvichealthprofessionals.com, and that is where we really dig into anything that has to do with the pelvis and how that impacts the human bodies that you are working with as a yoga teacher. We have amazing guest speakers that come in and talk to us every month, and we also do a monthly business Q&A call where I help with the answers that I can, and also all of our other members do as well. So if you want to learn about gender-affirming surgery, we're doing that in May with Dr. Christy Butler. Bowel health is being covered in June with Michelle Lyons. Energetics of the pelvis is with Leslie Howard in July. And desire and libido are the topic with Dr. Rose Schlaff in August of this year. So check this out over at pelvichealthprofessionals.com. Next week on the podcast, I am excited because we are going to be talking about mental health for entrepreneurs with Shulamit. I am so excited for this episode, and I think it is good timing. We have been living in this pandemic for a long time now together. We all know the impacts of stress on our mental health, and we're really going to look at how we can take care of ourselves. I think it goes along nicely after this episode with Barb, because as I shared earlier on, Barb really helped me to work self-care into my daily routine. And I think it's important that we have this conversation because we are taking care of a lot of people in our lives. Speaking of taking care, I want to give a huge shout out to our team over here, Suzanne, Crunch, and Sinead. Thank you for taking care of the content that we create, as well as our connected yoga teacher community. Thank you also to you, dear listener, for spending the time here. I realize that your life is busy and that you have choices of spending your time in many different ways. And so I just really appreciate that you've spent your time today here learning about bone health. And I am so curious to hear now what you might be working into your own day-to-day stuff or your own yoga practice. And I also want to close with the question of what will you be doing this week to stay connected to yourself, your yoga practice, and to your community so that you can share the yoga that lights you up.